So, Sammy, let's start off. I'm going to jump right in because everybody knows you. And if you
Yep.
don't, listen to a couple episodes. But tell us a little bit about your how you got interested in communication because we're going to talk a lot today about communication and how divided our country is and how we can navigate personally through this messy middle that is the divided country that we find ourselves in.
I don't know exactly where it started, but I'll jump in the middle of it. When I went to college, I have a degree in communication, not communications with an S at the end, because only communication nerds care about it. But the difference being the singular communication, as in the art of rhetoric, not mass communications or ways, methods, or mediums of communication. I care a little bit less about that and more about how we speak to each other, how we speak to ourselves, how we speak in groups, different things like that. I took a lot of different classes that you either were like a football player just trying to get a degree or a like crazy intense nerd about like the etymology of words and the study of why we picked this word and that word and all of these different things. So I was in the nerd category. I'm not a football player. And I still to this day care a lot about all of these things. And so much so that I've decided I'm going to be writing a book about it. And I'm going to be talking about how we can have better conversations, how we can be more intentional and on purpose with how we communicate with people, including a chapter about how do we talk to each other about politics and religion, because we have to talk about those things. I think.
Wait a minute. Are you saying you just outed yourself and like our podcast listeners are kind of the first to hear, unless you were hanging out with us at Podfest? This is brand new.
This is brand new. I'm going to write a book,
Sammy's going to write a
guys.
book.
And
Welcome to the journey.
one of the things that I was told at Podfest is when do you start marketing your book? The moment you decide to write it. So here we
Yes.
are deciding to write the book. You guys get to follow along on the journey. I'm sure there will be more episodes we have over the year where I'm like, hey, I'm writing about this thing. I need to unpack it. Let's help talk through it and see
Yeah.
what we're going to say about it and all of the stuff. So I I don't have like a lightning rod story about how I came up with the title yet. So for this point in time, I know it's going to be about communication. And frankly, it's probably going to be a lot about the things that I'm a broken record about that I just say over and over again that are so ingrained in me, which I think is where some of this is where you're wanting to go in how we talk about politics with each other.
Yeah. And we can call it politics and there's elements of it that are really a lot more about our humanity and about how we view other humans. And so I just if those are in case you're still listening and you're like, "Ugh, I don't want to talk about politics." Great. Then you
This episode
don't
is for you.
this episode is for you. Number 1, to give you a few skills in the toolbox, but number 2 also to really remind us that when we say something is political, it is just two sides of an equation. Even corporate politics is like, who are you trying to please? And it's really about the humans trying to work in a system, right? So political structures are set up so that we have a way to. It's just a system that we have defined, and so let's start. You have some good stories, some good kind of success stories that might lend some credibility, a little more credibility even than a degree. Big deal, you got a degree. Maybe you were one of those football players that are like, I didn't learn all this stuff, because I would say that the degree indicates you had an interest in it, but it's your lived experience and practical. You want to share a story about or two about kind of
Yeah.
this experience you had?
I so number 1, I take a pretty controversial approach that I can be friends with anybody on any side of the political aisle.
What? Stop the presses.
Controversial.
Very controversial. Somebody has a different political view than you, and you can be their friend? That doesn't mean they're a horrible person?
Here
Oh
is
my
the
word.
thing. Here is the thing. There are times where people's political views have a pretty negative, detrimental impact on somebody else. There are times where it's going to increase how much money you have to pay in your taxes, and that is going to have a very immediate, direct effect on your life. That is going to impact the policies and the ways people approach different minority groups, different majority groups, different whatever. And I do understand where some people come from when they say, if you believe XYZ thing, we cannot be friends. And I do hold space that there are some people out there that it is not necessarily safe for you to be friends with everybody across the aisle.
There's almost a
And
character element to it, right? It's not just that I believe in this ideology, but you really look to see what is their character in how they actually treat people.
yes,
Yes?
and I would argue, regardless of your character, I could probably convince you of a different political opinion. I could
Okay.
get you to agree with something that you don't know, you didn't mean to agree with. That's a very
But I
bold
mean, the
claim.
people you stay friends with, you don't make it about the political ideology that
Correct.
is the determinant of friendship. You look at their heart, their character, how they treat people, how they treat you, that determines whether or not you're gonna stay in that relationship and if that relationship is safe for you.
Correct, and I do think that, we've talked about at different times, friends have different levels of closeness to us, and there are some people that just because I am your friend and we have a great time together, there are you may not be in my closest inner circle. That is fair to say, and I think that it is a privilege that is not afforded to everybody to be able to stay in the room with people who you have different beliefs with. There's some people who need to step out of that room, that's fine. And then there are others of us who need to be a person in that room. Interestingly enough, you talk about what stories do I have about this? I got the opportunity to go to TED Fest a couple of years ago, where it's a conference for TEDx organizers, where people from all over the world gather together or near the TED headquarters. We were in New York City. And I remember sitting at lunch at a table with people from like 7 different countries, and they all had very strong views about how Americans treat guns. And they were like, "This is just ridiculous, and anybody who has this opinion about guns, like, they just must be dumb and stupid and every horrible thing about them." And I stood up and was like, "Well, hold on. I might agree with some of your policy executions, with some of these end result things, but just because somebody has a strong opinion in favor of guns does not make them dumb or stupid or anything, not even close. There is a story behind them. There is a family tradition, there is a heritage, there is a an identity at times that is not wrong. It is not incorrect. I think that where we get into trouble when talking about politics with people is that we talk sometimes just about like whatever the end result is, and we don't stay focused on the why of the conversation. So, for example, if I'm going to talk to somebody about guns, I don't want to talk about gun ownership and uh what do you think about the Second Amendment or anything like that. What I want to talk about is how do we feel about school shootings? Because school shootings are a really big problem in our country. And if we can both get on board with the conversation that school shootings need to decrease, period, the end. If we can't both agree with that premise statement, then yeah, we got to go different ways because I think that we are very misaligned if you think that there should be more school shootings. Um, Great, that's a non-starter conversation for me. But we all pretty much can agree that there should be less school shootings. How do we go about solving that problem? And that conversation is significantly more productive than what do you think about the Second Amendment?
Right.
That doesn't matter. I don't actually care what you think about any constitutional amendment, what you think about the Bill of Rights, what you think about Timbuktu or anything. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And how do we go about solving those problems? And so, even when some of the big sweeping, like, we just need to get rid of this and we need to I don't even know. I don't wanna give too many examples because 'cause I'm not trying to put people on
Mhm.
blast. When you don't focus on the problem, you miss the first step, and you're gonna be set up more towards failure than towards a successful conversation about politics.
I think that's
Yeah.
important to realize because essentially you're quoting a little Stephen Covey, which is start with the end in mind. One of
Yeah.
Seven Habits of Highly Successful People. And by agreeing the problem, that we agree on the problem, then it's often, if you look at political differences, it's often about the how,
Mhm.
not about the what. Now, I happen to do housing equity work at the national level, and there are people who deny the problem,
Right.
that it is hard to even get them to agree that there is a problem. And I spent 3.5 years trying to figure out a way to explain it to people that helped them to understand that there is an actual problem. And so now that I have gotten it down, I actually have gotten it down to a couple of sentences that makes it super personal and people get it. And then they're like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
And sometimes people will say, and having done this housing equity work, it is abhorrent that somebody doesn't even recognize there's a problem. And if somebody denies there's a problem, I'm like, then we're not explaining the problem well. Because there's some
Ooh.
people who say, like if somebody said, "Oh, there's not really that many school shootings." Okay, where's the facts of that? And if you can, that's a different conversation, starting with
Yeah.
figuring out what problem there is and agreeing that there is a problem. Now, the denial of a problem is challenging, and yet there's people that I have chosen to stay in relationship with because they're in positions of influence that it matters that they understand there is actually a problem. And their denial, I cannot allow them to continue to live in the denial. So I continue to stay in relationship and continue to try to explain it in ways that they can hear me so that we can actually make a difference.
And controversial point number 2, if you're the message sender, it's your responsibility to make sure that the message receiver interprets the message correctly. So, to get real nerdy in this, there is a whole diagram about like the communication flow, and you've got a message sender, a message receiver, you've got noise that can distort the message along the way. You've got the medium that can be how you communicate it. Is it a phone call? Is it in person? Is it a text message? Blah, 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 blah. There are some people who say it, who feel subconsciously or consciously, the person hearing what I have to say, well, they didn't hear me correctly. Well, they didn't interpret it the way I wanted them to interpret it. They assumed something different. I disagree that it is the receiver's job to make sure the message is interpreted correctly. I fully believe that it is on the sender to do their work to make sure that they use the right tone, the right words, the right double check. Did you, this is what I intended to say. Is this what you heard? It sounds like you might think I said something different. My apologies for not sending a clear message. This is what I mean. I think that's the sender's job. And so if somebody else says this isn't a problem, when they say, "Well, it's abhorrent that somebody doesn't believe that there is a problem." I hear you. That's your job to convince somebody and to
Ooh,
communicate that message.
so you are the one that normally gets to call BS on me. I'm gonna call some I'm gonna call some challenge, throwing the challenge flag,
Do it.
because I will say that yes, and you also have to look at the power differential. If there
Mhm.
is an imbalance of power, then I think the person that has the higher level of power has added responsibility. And by that I mean that as an employer, if one of my employees comes to me, I can't sit there, and I control their paycheck, I control whether they keep a job, I control all those things, and they're trying to communicate to me, which puts their nervous system in a state of flux. It is my responsibility as a person in a position of influence. If you don't want to call it power, you want to call it a position of influence. It is my responsibility to work harder than the person sending it. And it is my responsibility in that position of influence to say, I think this is what I heard. Can you please clarify that? So I'm going to say yes typically if there are equals, if you're peers, but if you have to factor that in, especially because we're talking about politics and we're talking about communities, specifically communities of color who have been in disadvantaged situations for decades and generations, then if you are not in that, and if you are more, if you identify more easily, or if you are, I'll just say it, white passing, where then you've gotten the advantage of being in the majority in our country, then you have a little more responsibility, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't mean that the other person shouldn't try. They should try, but I can't let it go without at least mentioning that the
I
power
think that
differential is different.
power differential definitely is a factor. I would put that in the noise category. And where I'll yes and you is that we don't always get to control how the person in power
Sure.
receives our message. We don't
No.
always have bosses that are
No, we don't.
going to be on purpose. And so you to walk into somebody's office and say, "This is what I think about something and I need you to receive it this way."
Is
You have the most ownership of how you send that message.
yes.
And can if you are needing to achieve a certain goal, if you are needing to you're starting the conversation, you have the end in mind, then it's on you. And I don't say that that's without acknowledging that power is going to be a factor of noise that's going to distort your message both ways from the person in power talking to a person with less power or vice versa. And you can control your
You can
response and
only
things.
control.
You can only control how you present your message, how you follow up to make sure that they understood what you had to say. And from the standpoint of when we're talking about politics, I will say I think this conversation is a lot more about how are you talking to people around you. This is less about how you should call your state representatives and talk to them. This is more about
Yeah.
you work with somebody who has a different political view than you. You go to Thanksgiving dinner with somebody who has a different political view than you.
Yeah.
I think that the other big tip is to uh, lead with curiosity
Mm.
because when we ask people about themselves, they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel noticed. And when you ask somebody, like, what led them to this belief? What story happened to them? What moment when they were young that impacted them that they feel really passionately about this? And that story, by acknowledging it and bringing air to it, bringing light to it, you can connect into shared humanity. You can empathize. You can say, oh man, that sucks. I hate that child you had to go through that. Even if you don't agree with their end result conclusions, you can still hate that their child self had to go through this trauma, this event, this something, and hurt for them and with them. And that curiosity to see where does this come from really can change the game in your conversations about politics.
Oh my goodness. This is a lot.
Well, I have one more tip before we go.
Okay.
Um, it's a long game.
Mm.
If you are talking to people and having conversations, when you think about what is the end in mind, if the end in mind is I want to make this stranger feel put in their place, great, then that's what you can do. Acknowledge that that actually is your goal. It's not necessarily contributing to the collective society and humanity, but it can be your goal. If it is, I wanna have a pleasant holiday meal with my family where we don't have to get heated, then acknowledge that that's your goal. I currently have my father-in-law backed into a corner. I'm joking. I love you, Mike. I have now had enough conversations with him that I pressed him one time. I said, "So what are you gonna do one day if I run for office and I have a different letter after my name than what you normally vote for, and you have the opportunity to vote for me? What are you gonna do?" And he goes, "Sammy, don't do that to me. Don't put me in this position, this existential crisis that I'd have to choose between my political party and my daughter-in-law." And I was like, that right there, the doubt that you don't know that you would vote for your political party, that's what I'm gonna hold on to. Um,
Mm.
the relationship that he and I have built, that I now am fine to have pretty much any political conversation about anything, even though he and I are on very different sides of the aisle. We can hear each other out, and he will sometimes ask me, "What are you thinking about this thing that your party's doing right now?" Have a lot of big feelings about it, but I want to know what you're thinking about it. And we can have those conversations where he is now reciprocating curiosity. Think about
Wow.
the long game. Think about curiosity. Have the end goal in mind. If the end goal is maintaining a relationship, staying in the room, then that's slow sandpapering down. Okay. Sandpapering is a slow process.
Mm.
Conversations with politics, take care of yourself. Feel free to excuse yourself when you need to, when you feel like you're getting too worked up. And try to focus on what we can do to help move collective society forward, agreeing on what problems we're trying to solve and going about it that way, because everybody's big emotions oftentimes boils down to fear, and seeing people's fear and seeing people where they are can make a big difference.
This is fantastic. I have a feeling this is not going to be our last conversation. We had just a few minutes today to squeeze this in, and really felt like it was timely, and wanted to give people some just very quick tools. And if we have other episodes, Sammy, that you think about that have might also speak to this. I know we talked about at the year end a couple of books that we had read that actually would help with this idea. Maybe we can add those to the show notes for some resources.
That's a great idea.
Okay. So until the next time, we hope you all go be freaking awesome.